AP Cram, the AP Human Geography exam, free response, question 10, political cultural consequences of superimposed African borders. Remember that Section 2 consists of free response questions. There are 3 questions that should be formatted as short essay answers, and you have 75 minutes to complete them, so allocate your time properly. The free response section is 50% of your exam score. You're required to define and explain and apply geographic concepts and also interpret geographic data. Okay? Describe political or cultural consequences of superimposed boundaries in Africa. Okay, so a political/cultural consequence of superimposed boundaries in Africa is either a multinational or a multi-ethnic state. But what does this mean? I'll give you a moment to think. It means that separate nations lie within the same territory, okay? A political consequence of superimposed African borders is a multi-state nation. Now, this is a little bit different from the previous flashcard, but so what does this mean in particular? I'll give you a moment to think. It means that a cultural group is dissected, that is split into pieces and made into minority groups. A political/cultural result of superimposed borders in Africa is internal struggle. What does this mean? I'll give you a moment to think. It means there's increased likelihood of religious, ethnic, or tribal conflict. A political result of superimposed, or consequence rather, it's not necessarily like a positive result, of superimposed African borders is external struggle. What does this mean in this context? I'll give you a moment to think. It means increased likelihood of international, regional, or cross-border conflict. A cultural consequence of superimposed African borders is loss of culture. What does this mean in particular? It means a loss of language, cultural traditions, etc. Anything along the lines of these facets of culture. Okay? A cultural/political consequence of superimposed African borders is a new language. What are the implications of this phenomenon? I'll give you a moment to think. That means European or regional languages, like for example Swahili, becomes the official language or lingua franca. Lingua franca meaning a new language that is adopted as the ubiquitous predominant language that may not have been the original native tongue. Okay? A cultural consequence of superimposed African borders is cultural syncretism or synthesis. There's synthesis amongst what? Which is kind of obvious in the title of this card. There's syncretism between different cultural groups of a single country. That means you have several cultures being melded or blended together. Okay? And what emerges is like a new culture of its own. A political result of superimposed African borders is migration. What are the implications of this phenomenon? I'll give you a moment to think. Well, for starters, this may increase the number of refugees or internally displaced persons, and traditional or seasonal migration patterns that would normally occur outside of this are disrupted. Okay? A political consequence of superimposed African borders is government change. What are the implications of this phenomenon? I'll give you a moment to think. Well, nation building difficulties ensue. Their non-viable states come into formation, and there's a formation of new independent states and relocated capitals. Things just get kind of like mishmashed and pushed around all over the place. Okay? This may be one of the most far-reaching consequences of a superimposed border on Africa or any nation. A political consequence of superimposed African borders is lost or limited access to natural resources. How does this ensue? Well, this ensues because of economic dependency. The newly governed territory that had the borders superimposed now becomes subservient to the colonial, ruling body, and their economy is usurped. And so, although they might be producing the goods, it's not in their control. They don't have power over distribution. So they become economically dependent, even though they may be in a region where they can produce. They might not be able to because of certain laws. So this can be, explained at length. So just look up a point and stick with it in your mind just in case it comes up on the actual test day. A political consequence of superimposed African borders is ineffective governance. What are the implications of this phenomenon? I'll give you a moment to think. Governments, antecedent treaties, and laws are less effective. And in case you don't know what antecedent means, that means things that were in effect before some, occurrence. The occurrence here being the superimposed border. Okay? A political consequence of superimposed African borders is the formation of political and economic hubs. These centers can be likened to places like Manhattan, Chicago, Los Angeles. They are a nexus for important state affairs and business. Where do they usually occur, and what are the implications for these hubs or business centers? Well, it's important to know that diffusion patterns extend from these ports because they're usually, located at important water regions, regions bordering a water body, I should say, along coasts. So the diffusion patterns extend along coasts and then to points inland, maybe like to capital cities or other important inland cities. Okay.